Sanctions has objected, and we have to make sure that it does not get dragged beyond what it is intended to. Otherwise, you lose the whole purpose of it. This is my personal view. You are the guru, Mr. Your Excellency Micheal, and we will learn. We're learning from you. And
so I think to take a step back and to think about where we are right now, we've had probably the most unprecedented amount of global unity between the United States, the EU, the G7, and even countries like Switzerland. New Zealand has come out with a new sanctions law. So the activity in Russia has galvanized really the world regarding pulling the financial plumbing from Russia. And I think to put it into perspective, the actions of the world to go after a G20 country's financial reserves, the 11th largest country in the world, over $400 billion overnight, just unavailable, is just unprecedented. And I think going after the central bank's financial reserves was more powerful and more potent than SWIFT, which was a big conversation leading up to this conflict. And I think what's happened, and you've seen this with companies, currencies, transactions, is that the view right now is that the financial jurisdiction of Russia is kryptonite. And anything you touch has the possibility of being sanctionable. And so it's a very precarious moment. And it's heartbreaking to watch what's happening in Ukraine. And the world is obviously galvanized to try to act to move forward. The goal of sanctions is not to create a long bad behavior and to hurt civilians or to create humanitarian issues. The goal of sanctions is to act as a deterrent and to have a deterrence effect and hopefully to change behavior. I think if you look at past examples where sanctions were successful, the first Iran deal brought Iran to the table. Now, obviously, we're in a different negotiations right now, and that is playing out before our eyes. With regards to the use of the Patriot Act over the years, with a Section 311 of the Patriot Act, which basically makes a institution or a jurisdiction a primary money laundering concern. And in my view, on Russia right now, what the world has done is akin to a Section 311 of the Patriot Act, because nobody wants to touch Russia. And so I think that it's been quite fast. I don't think Russia expected the EU and others to go after the financial reserves this quickly. And that's because of what Russia was trying to build up in their financial reserves. They have around 17% left in China. They've got 140 billion in gold, but they're having some major financial issues. And I expect the costs to continue. I think the next steps will be the U.S. acting on oil and gas. And I do think that will be a unilateral action by the United States. And I think that will be likely followed by a very similar effort that was done with regards to Iran in 2013. And if you look at that playbook and you look at what happened, the US took unilateral action, and then the US worked with countries that had a lot of exposure to Iran and had a plan for each of them where they could draw down their exposure and that the actual money and reserves was kept in foreign reserves in those countries. So Iran couldn't get access to the money. I expect, Mohammed, a very similar path potentially to take place, because obviously we don't want to create barrel of oil going too high. We don't want to create too much uncertainty in the market. And so I expect there to be a middle ground where we work with our EU partners, our G7 partners, and our global partners to find the right balance to deal with the energy crisis.
Okay. Now, I would ask questions, but it might be, I'm sure you have, I don't know if it's a challenging or non-challenging, but I'm sure you are the right one to speak here. You are the person who would have his views on that. With respect to the creation of what we call an alternative financial model. Now, of course, you've heard about the payment system that China has developed. And when you look at the export items, that's at the financial level. So you have a financial system by which maybe Russia can use and utilize. I don't know to what extent China would agree to facilitate that. On the import level, the import level from the EU specifically, since it's the largest trading partner for Russia, you would think that China would act as a facilitator of an economic ecosystem. And already they have some establishment for that. But what are the measures that the US will take at the very strategic level, and also at the financial and at the trade level, to make sure that this does not happen?
Sure. So, Mohammed, I think as we speak today, a new financial order is emerging and has been emerging for years. You and I have spoken about this, that we are entering and have been in a multi-currency world. Dollar central bank reserves have been dropping since the euro came into existence. And so the dollar central bank reserves are below 60%. I expect at some point they will drop below 50%. Now the question is, well, what's making up the difference? Sure, more are using the euro. There's an argument that the Chinese yuan will overtake the dollar at some point. I think that's very unlikely in the short or medium term. I think what's more likely is there's going to be a basket of currencies approach. People and the consumer want options. And so I think that when you have a conflict like we're having right now, it only highlights even more that authoritarian governments do not want to operate in a dollar or euro-based system. And so, yes, the Chinese have been working on creating offshoots, a separate SWIFT, the Chinese digital yuan, which was highlighted during the Olympics. The Russians have started a pilot program for a digital ruble, but very early, and would not be able to use the digital ruble for any sanctions evasion right now because it's not operational at this point. So that's an important point to make. With regards to the Chinese and the Russians, yes, we've seen reports that they may have deeper financial collaboration. There may be possibilities to move the ruble to the yuan and to create more of an economic balance between union pay and so forth. The Chinese are in a strong negotiating position right now, a position they like to be in. And I expect that they will grow closer. They will try to weaponize their central banks in the future, and they'll weaponize finance to be able to work together to operate outside the dollar. Now, the next few months for the Russian central bank are going to be incredibly difficult because the world, most of the world has left Russia. And so they are burning through money. The ruble is worth barely anything. And they're going to have to rely on China and other partners to prop them up. And so I think that it's important to note what China is doing. I think Iran will take a very similar playbook, and they'll digitize their real and create a central bank digital currency. But whether it's going to be a successful vehicle for their economies and for sanctions evasion, I think is very premature. I think what this moment is teaching us is that in a crisis, Mohammed, people want dollars and euros on their books. Now, we are in an era of the highest level of financial warfare. And some would say you only have one shot at true financial warfare. And so I do think out of this conflict, you will have a new financial order. On one side, you'll have China, Russia, Iran, other authoritarian governments who will weaponize their central banks to go around the dollar, around the euro. And then you're going to have the G7 like-minded governments who are all shifting towards central bank digital currencies, and they will prioritize equity, financial inclusion. They'll try to promote privacy in their payment structure. And that will be the divide. That will be the new financial order. But I do see a schism and two separate systems emerging.
Okay. Now, of course, in the context of the economic statecraft, what do you feel? I mean, I've heard here and there that Russia has its own economic statecraft initiatives, or I don't know if it's a plan or it's a. How effective do you think they are? I mean, of course, energy is one of the tools that could be effective. So, how effective is their, what you call it, counter economic sanctions?
Well, I think that their options are becoming more limited by the day. There have been reports that the oligarchs and the Russians could use digital assets or cryptocurrencies to have sanctions evasion or go around the current sanctions in place. And I think that's highly unlikely. I think the amount that they would need, there's not capacity for it currently on the digital asset exchanges. It would be too obvious. Of course, you're going to have some illicit actors use digital assets and use all means to move money illicitly. We've always seen that through jewelry or art or other, semi-unregulated markets. So I expect that criminal level of money laundering to continue. But yes, Russia has energy, and they are going to use that at every level. There are great dependencies on Russia, as we know, from Germany, Italy, Hungary, to name a few. And so I think that this will finally be the moment where Europe realizes that it can't be dependent on an authoritarian government like Russia moving forward. And I think what you're going to see is Christine Lagarde and other leaders in Europe start to work on a pathway towards really decoupling from their dependence on the energy sector in Russia. It will take time. I think the US is going to work with them, and that's part of this new financial order. But I think when you're a country that becomes increasingly isolated and the costs on you and your citizens are increasing, and when you go to the metro in the morning and you can't use your payment app to get through the stall, you know that sanctions are hurting. And I was there in 2014, Mohammed, when Russia, invaded Crimea. And I remember the costs that my colleagues and I at Treasury and the US government put on Russia. And they were meaningful. They were debt and equity restrictions. They were a new kind of sanctions. And that was one form of an escalation ladder. But Mohammed, we are in a new order where the escalation ladder has moved to places that I wish that we would not see. And I think that as every day goes by, the financial options for Russia, the window continues to close. Unfortunately, we've seen what Russia has done in other cases in Syria and others regarding humanitarian, crisis. And so I think as violence on the ground increases, there's no other option but to look for additional costs to go after the financial options of Russia.
So in light of this, you would see that the economic sanction is the most viable option for the US and the European allies, because
well, I think it's a very viable, important option, but I also think there are other tools, other forms of close diplomacy that we're working with their allies right now, coupled with financial sanctions. I think financial sanctions are one part of a larger strategy, and you've seen NATO be more united than ever before. The ability for the United States and the European Union to do sanctions on the reserves of a central bank this quickly, it's unprecedented. This was very quick, and so I think it's one part of a larger strategy, but you've got the Europeans and many countries around the world very hawkish on this approach. And I think that's important because I think if you let bad behavior like this take place, it sets a precedent for other authoritarian governments. And that's why this moment, this inflection point is so critical. But it really is an inflection point for the financial order. And I expect that when we look back at this moment, this will be a watershed moment for how the new financial lines were being drawn, how digital asset exchanges came out of this moment, how DAOs raised money for Ukraine. So all of these things, this is all their first conflict. This is their first war in this new era of the future of money and finance. And so many of these areas are really going to have a different story, a different approach going forward because of this, especially the digital asset space. Because I really think that this is going to be an interesting moment, coupled with an incoming executive order on digital assets, which is going to happen any day now in the United States, coupled with greater regulation of the digital asset space. All of this is happening at once. And so I do think there's an interesting intersection of geopolitics, digital assets, and how they work together in a time like this, but also companies around the world. You've seen almost every major company financially disconnect their plumbing from Russia. And so I think, business schools and sanctions courses going forward, this will be looked at as truly an inflection point in that time.
Okay. Now this brings us to the one issue, which is how long that this take, how long an economic sanction will take in order for it to be effective and to change the behavior.
Well, I mean, that is the question. And I think we've seen that, some financial sanctions take some time to actually really hurt and have costs. The goal is to change Putin's calculus. The goal is to ultimately create an off-ramp where we can have a resolution of this conflict. I think right now it is going to take some time. If you look at what happened in Crimea, nothing has changed meaningfully since 2014. And so that obviously is one bucket to look at, that since 2014, we've maintained sanctions on Crimea. And nothing has changed in Putin's calculus. I think this is going to go on for the foreseeable future. I don't have a prediction on when I think it will end. I think, sadly, we're going to see more loss of life, more humanitarian crisis, more refugees cross into Poland and bordering countries. And I'm not sure there is an approach in the short term to truly shift Putin's calculus. I think what needs to occur are enough costs around him where he would feel engulfed or encircled, and probably some countries that have remained neutral in this conflict would need to create some more pressure against him and Russia. And then there would need to be an off-ramp for him to hold a certain part of territory and to come to some sort of resolution. I don't see that happening in the short term.
And with regard, an important question I think it's we need to address is now probably in the MENA region and the Middle Eastern region, there were some reluctance. I would say, not there is a desire, I can express it, to remain somehow neutral in this conflict. Now, of course, that would affect the future of the sanctions. How would you think the best way to deal with that? I mean, what would the U.S. would offer to the parties in the MENA and the Middle East and
Well, I think I would go back to how the United States handled Iran in 2013. The United States worked with countries that were remaining neutral, that did have energy exposure to Iran, and there was a customized plan to draw down that exposure, but not disrupt those countries' economies, where they kept the foreign reserves in Iran, in those countries, so that Iran couldn't have access to it. And so I think that if those countries that are remaining neutral were open to it, they would follow a similar path where the US would work with them to draw down their energy exposure and to make sure that there was as least amount of economic disruption to their country and to their markets. That would be the most sensible path. My expectation is that many of the neutral countries will likely stay on the fence for the foreseeable future, and that will take some time.
Do you, I mean, of course, one of the areas, one of the main elements is that, as you mentioned, their exposure to energy. In fact, we have some countries that have an arrangement with Russia with respect to energy price. And what do you think that the current embargo on US on Russians oil output is somehow to ensure or fit within that customizable arrangement that would ensure that you can have the same objective or the same level of output that you desire and the price level that you desire, but by working with the US and allies?
Well, I think that there will need to be global cooperation on energy moving forward. Obviously, the future of OPEC will be part of this debate, and how much influence Russia will have in OPEC moving forward. But I think that what we're witnessing against innocent civilians in Ukraine, it breaks my heart. And to see children cross the border displaced, just like every refugee crisis, it's heartbreaking. And I think that responsible countries, even though there are economic implications, need to work together in a time like this to figure out the best course of action moving forward. And even if there are some costs in the short term. But I really think that, listen, Iran and Russia are two very different countries. Russia has much more exposure to the world than Iran did. So this will be a new case study on how that can be done. I expect it to take longer, and I expect there to be economic courage needed by many of these countries in order for them to make the decision that a customized plan would work for them. My expectation is that will take some time, and I expect the United States probably to increase drilling at home, and it will increase urgency to become less dependent on others around the world. I think the big question is what happens to the global climate agenda. I think, unfortunately, that gets put aside until this conflict can have somewhat of a resolution and a new financial order, and likely a new energy order is emerging before us.
Yes. Coming to our last question, Mr. Micheal, I mean, what is your views on the liberal order? I mean, how do you view it? People speak about the emergence of what we call it a multipolar order, and they have the justification for it, and they base it on cultural, I mean, heritage base. I'm sure you've heard about. There are some political circles within, academic circle within Russia who propose the idea of a multipolar world, and of course you have the liberal economic order as the on the other side, and you have institutions, nations, many who believe that this is the real future of humanity. And I think the way the battle would go in that part of Eurasia would have impact on our view. So that's why it becomes critical as well for those who are true believers in the liberal economic order, and there are many. But I'm seeing an emergence of people who have a different view.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very good question, and I think there are cracks in that order, and there are schisms that have been lurking for years. And I think, Mohammed, the future and the present, in my judgment, are a pushback against global institutions and a pushback against that the current order has not been successful for all. And that's why you're going to see a larger growth towards decentralization. And that is why I really believe the future of money, the future of the digital wallet will be a combination of decentralized finance, stable coins, and central bank digital currencies, perhaps together, perhaps separate, but all operating for different purposes. And I think the growth in decentralized finance is very much a result of a resistance against that liberal economic order. More people in non-authoritarian countries, they want greater financial inclusion. They want equity. They want more ownership. And I think the consumer has demanded this for years. And I think one of the pathways that the United States faces going forward is how will the US, how will the EU wield the dollar and the euro and make it a force of good for the world, not just a hammer, not just a form of dominance, but make it work for the world. Now, I think that decentralized finance is here to stay. It's part of the future of money. And I believe that each of them will live alongside each other under a new regulatory structure, a new compass that's needed with different purposes. And I think that is the result of this multipolar world, where you're not just going to see one currency or two currencies lead the way. You are going to see, and we're seeing it before our eyes right now as we speak today, the emergence of a new Bretton Woods, a new era of Bretton Woods, where multiple currencies will be the options on the global financial menu going forward. And that menu will have many options, and that is what the consumer wants moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Michael, for your answers and your intelligent understanding of the global financial order and the global financial system itself. And I would like to thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. It was a pleasure to be with you in the center, and I look forward to being back again soon.
Thank you.